I wasn't sure when it started the growing distance between me and my mother. There were no sudden, explosive arguments or major betrayals. Nothing that would give me a clear-cut reason for why things had become so strained. It was more like a slow erosion. Small things chipping away over time until one day I realized the whole foundation was unstable. And it was in moments like this, when the weight of her expectations pressed down on me, that I felt the true heaviness of it all. The phone call came on a Thursday afternoon, just as I was finishing up at work. I had a few papers scattered on my desk, half of them marked with urgent red pen, deadlines looming. But when I saw my mother's name flash on the screen, a knot formed in my stomach. Alex. Sweetheart, her voice was cheerful. The kind of tone that's usually a precursor to something I don't want to hear. I've decided to host another dinner next weekend. You know, a little gathering for the friends I invited last time. The usual crowd. But this time, I want it to be even better. I was thinking of upgrading the menu, maybe a private chef. And of course, we'll need some fine wine. It'll be lovely. But I'll need you to contribute. Just like last time. We can't make this work without you. Honey. I blinked, trying to steady my breath. My mind raced. I had helped out before. Of course. Every time she threw one of these grand events, I felt the pull to assist, usually financially. Sometimes by running errands. Always by supporting her efforts to make everything perfect. But this time felt different. This time, the pressure was suffocating. My savings were meager at best. And my monthly bills left me scraping by. The idea of putting down hundreds of dollars for another extravagant dinner for a group of people I barely knew felt unfair. But my mother's voice, bright, almost pleading, didn't give me much room to maneuver. I just know this will make everyone so happy. And you know how much it means to me when we all get together. It'll be a night to remember. Darling. I let out a long breath, knowing where this was headed. Mom. I don't know. I really can't afford to pay for this right now. I've got some things coming up. And it's just not in the budget. There was a brief silence on the other end. I could almost hear her mind working. The way she always tried to find a way around any objection. Finally, she spoke. Her tone turning sharp. Almost cold. Alex. This is the third time this year. I've helped you out when you've needed it. And now, when I need you, you're telling me you can't afford it. You're being selfish. You know that. The words hit me like a slap. Selfish. The accusation stung deeper than any financial burden she could place on me. I had always tried to be a good daughter, obedient, helpful, even sacrificing my own needs to make her happy. But now, in her eyes, I was the selfish one. I didn't know how to respond. I felt the blood rush to my face as shame twisted inside me. I didn't mean that. Mom. I don't have the money to spare right now. I'm doing the best I can, I said, my voice faltering. She sighed, the sound heavy and disappointed. Well, if that's how you feel, I suppose I'll have to make other arrangements. But don't expect me to keep asking if you can't even show some generosity. It's always about you, isn't it? The words echoed in my mind long after the call ended. I hung up the phone. The silence in my apartment suddenly deafening. My heart pounded in my chest as I stared at the desk in front of me. I couldn't breathe. Was I selfish? I had always thought that I was just taking care of myself. That I was being practical. Setting boundaries where they were needed. But in my mother's eyes, nothing was ever enough. No matter how much I gave, it was never enough to satisfy her. And now I was being called selfish for choosing not to give more. The next few hours were a blur of activity. But my mind kept returning to the conversation. I tried to focus on my work, to push the thoughts away. But they kept creeping back in. The guilt, sharp and invasive, gnawed at me. What was I supposed to do? How could I reconcile the desire to care for myself, to save for the future, with the constant pull of my mother's expectations? I needed answers. But I didn't know where to turn. I couldn't talk to her again, not now. Not after the way she'd reacted. There was no room for compromise in her world, only her demands. Her expectations. She couldn't see it from my perspective. How could I make her understand? That night, I tried to sleep. But the guilt wouldn't let me rest. It felt like it was consuming me, filling every corner of my mind, suffocating me. The next few days were quiet. But the weight of that conversation continued to follow me. I went about my routine, work, errands, the mundane tasks that made up most of my life, but everything felt more difficult. Every time my phone buzzed, I half expected it to be my mother again, asking for more. It didn't help that when I tried to tell my friends about the situation, they seemed so disconnected from what I was feeling. "She's your mom," one of them said, brushing it off. "She just wants to spend time with you. Right? It's not a big deal." But it was a big deal. It wasn't just about spending time with her. It was about the unspoken expectation that I had to sacrifice my own well-being to meet hers. I started to question whether I was just a tool for her social events, a means to an end. She had her friends, her gatherings, her lavish dinners, but did she even care about me beyond that? Did she care about me as a person, with my own hopes and struggles? Or was I just a pawn in her world of appearances? These questions gnawed at me, eating away at the peace I had once had in my life. It wasn't long before I found myself in a situation I didn't want to be in. The bills had piled up, my credit card balance had crept higher than I was comfortable with. I had taken out a small loan for a car repair a few months back. And now I was struggling to make ends meet. There was nothing left to offer. The breaking point came on a Sunday afternoon, a few days after the phone call. I had gone out to buy groceries when I noticed a familiar red envelope sticking out of my mailbox. It was from my mother. I opened it slowly, dreading what I would find inside. There was a note, short, to the point. "Alex, I'm hosting a bigger dinner this time. I expect your contribution. It's not about the money, it's about family. We're a family. Don't forget that. Love. Mom." The words stung more than I expected. I didn't feel loved. Not in that moment. I didn't feel like part of the family. I felt like an obligation. I was just a resource to her, someone to fill the gaps when she couldn't manage everything herself. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that I had been running on empty for too long. Constantly trying to please her. Constantly trying to meet her impossible expectations. But where was the love in that? I couldn't keep going like this. I couldn't let her dictate my life, my happiness, my future. I couldn't ignore it anymore. The thought of continuing down this same path, tiptoeing around my mother's demands, was unbearable. But I wasn't ready to face her again. The guilt from that last phone call still burned. And the idea of having another conversation with her, one where I had to defend myself, justify my actions, and explain my feelings, felt like too much. So, I did what I always did when the pressure became too great. I shut down. I closed off. For the next few days, I pretended the problem didn't exist. I went to work. I did the things I had to do. And I avoided my mother's calls. But the silence only made things worse. Each day, the tension between us grew thicker, more suffocating, until I couldn't breathe without feeling like I was choking on my own indecision. It was Friday evening when I finally picked up the phone. The number that appeared on the screen was from my mom. I'd been avoiding her all week. But I knew I couldn't keep this up forever. I let it ring twice before I answered. Mom. Her voice was soft. Almost too soft. Like she was testing the waters. Alex. I've been trying to reach you. We need to talk. I didn't respond right away. The weight of her words was heavy. Of course we needed to talk. But how could I explain the way I felt? How could I tell her that I felt suffocated? Trapped in a cycle of guilt and obligation that I couldn't break. I've been thinking about what you said. I began. My voice tight. Unsure of how to continue. And I don't know how to explain this. But I can't keep doing this. I can't keep giving in every time you ask. There was a long silence on the other end. Then her voice came. Colder than before. So now you're just going to abandon your family? I've done everything for you. Alex. I've supported you. I've given you everything. And now, you turn your back on me because you're too busy with your own life. I closed my eyes, fighting back the sting of her words. My mother had always had a way of turning things around, twisting them until I was the one who seemed in the wrong. I'm not abandoning anyone, I said quietly, trying to keep my emotions in check. I just can't keep sacrificing my future for everyone else. I have my own life to live. Mom. I have my own responsibilities. You're being selfish, she repeated. As though those two words were the only argument she had left. Selfish and ungrateful. It was the same old accusation. The same words she always used when she wanted to manipulate me. The same words that made me question whether I was doing the right thing. But this time, something inside me snapped. I'm not selfish, I said. My voice stronger now. I'm not ungrateful. I'm just trying to take care of myself. You don't get it. You never have. Her breath hitched on the other end. So, that's it. You're just going to walk away from your own mother. Fine. Maybe you're right. Maybe I've been asking too much. Maybe I've been too much for you. I didn't respond. I wanted to. I wanted to tell her that this wasn't about walking away. That I wasn't abandoning her. But I couldn't find the words. I didn't know how to fix something that felt so broken. The call ended with her muttering something I didn't quite catch. I sat there for a long time, staring at the phone, as the weight of her words hung in the air like smoke. I had stood up for myself. For once. But at what cost? The days that followed were difficult. Full of quiet loneliness and a deep sense of regret. I had never wanted to hurt my mother. I had always done my best to be there for her. To make her proud. To be the daughter she wanted. But now I felt like I had let her down in the worst possible way. The rift between us seemed irreparable. I didn't know how to fix it. And yet, I couldn't go back to where we were before. That would mean giving in. Returning to the same unhealthy cycle of guilt and sacrifice. I knew, deep down, that if I didn't stand my ground now, I would never be able to. But standing my ground felt like a betrayal. The echoes of her disappointment reverberated through my mind at night. waking me from fitful dreams. Every time I passed by my phone, I half expected another call from her, demanding an apology. But it didn't come. Days turned into weeks. And still, I didn't hear from her. My mother, always the one who reached out, who made the first move, had fallen silent. It was strange. At first, I thought that maybe this silence meant that she understood, that she needed time to process what had happened. But as the days stretched on, I began to feel the weight of that silence more than anything else. I felt lost. Had I done the right thing? Was this the kind of relationship I wanted? One where the only way to be seen was to sacrifice everything for the other person? Or was there a middle ground? A way to love and support each other without losing myself in the process? It was a Saturday morning, almost 2 weeks after our last conversation, when I received the message. It wasn't a phone call, which was surprising. Instead, it was a simple text. "I've been thinking about what you said. I'm sorry, Alex. I want to make things right." My heart skipped a beat as I stared at the screen. My mother, apologizing. 4 years. I had waited for a moment like this. But now, when it came, I didn't know how to respond. I felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. Was this real? Had she truly understood what I was saying? Or was this just another attempt to get what she wanted? "It's been hard for me, too." The text continued. "I've always thought I was doing what was best for us. I never meant to make you feel like you didn't matter. I can see now how much pressure I've put on you. I'm sorry." I read the message over and over again. My emotions swirled inside me. I hadn't expected this. Not from her. Not in a million years. I wanted to believe it. I wanted to believe that my mother could see things from my perspective. But the fear of being let down again held me back. I took a deep breath, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. How do you respond to an apology like this? One that seemed so genuine, yet came with so much history. I wasn't sure I was ready for reconciliation. But I also didn't want to leave things hanging, unresolved. "I'm glad you reached out." I typed slowly. "I think we both need some time to process everything. But maybe we can talk soon." I hit send, my heart racing. It wasn't a perfect resolution. It wasn't an immediate fix. But it was a start. The days that followed were a slow, painful rebuild. My mother and I talked more. But it wasn't easy. There were awkward silences, moments of tension, and old wounds that had to be addressed. But over time, something changed. There was a shift, a new understanding between us. It wasn't about perfection. It was about learning to communicate without guilt, without manipulation. For the first time, we were trying to meet each other halfway. I began to set clearer boundaries. And for once, they were respected. And my mother, she started to change, too. I could see it in her actions. In the way she no longer expected me to bear the weight of everything. And in the small gestures she made to show she cared in ways that didn't involve money or grand events. I won't pretend it was easy. Rebuilding a relationship that had been fractured takes time. But what I learned in those months was invaluable. I learned that it was okay to say no. I learned that I didn't have to lose myself to be loved. And I learned that real love, the kind that lasts, isn't about what you give, but about how you respect each other's needs. In the end, the dinner that had once caused so much tension came and went. This time, I helped in my own way, not financially, but by simply being present. By showing up without feeling burdened. And for the first time, I felt at peace with my decision. The story of my mother and me wasn't perfect. It wasn't without its struggles. But it was ours. And for the first time, I was okay with that. Weeks passed. And the silence that had once felt so oppressive began to dissipate. But as the days went by, I found myself thinking more and more about the person I had been before all this began. The daughter who bent under the weight of her mother's expectations. The person who put herself last. Time and time again. Simply to keep the peace. Was that really me? Or had I been playing a role in someone else's script? I had learned to speak my truth, to ask for space when I needed it. To refuse when I couldn't afford the luxury of a generous heart. But what came with this newfound strength was an uncomfortable loneliness. A feeling of being disconnected from the version of myself that had always sought to please. I no longer knew where the line between who I was and who I was supposed to be existed. Then one evening, nearly a month after that first painful conversation, my mother called. I had been waiting for it. For some reason, I wasn't surprised. But when I picked up, there was an air of calm about her voice that made me hesitate. "Alex," she said. Her tone softer than I remembered. "I've been thinking about our conversation. I want to apologize for everything. For pushing you too hard. I was trying to make everything perfect, because that's how I was taught to love. I thought that if I could make everything look right, you'd feel happy. Safe. But I see now that I've been doing it all wrong. I've been so caught up in the idea of perfection that I didn't stop to ask you what you really needed. What you wanted. And I'm sorry for that." The words were like a balm on an open wound. I didn't know what to say at first. This wasn't the mother I knew. This wasn't the woman who had wielded guilt like a weapon. This was something different. "You don't need to apologize," I said, my voice shaky. "But I'm glad you're saying this. I think we both had a lot to learn. I've spent so much time trying to please you that I forgot about my own needs. I need to find a way to love myself. To take care of myself before I can do anything for anyone else." Her breath was steady on the other end of the phone. "I know. Darling. I know. And I want you to know that I see you now. I see who you are. Not just the daughter I wanted you to be, but the person you are becoming. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments where the guilt crept in. There were still times when the old patterns tried to resurface. But this moment, this conversation, marked a shift. A real one. A shift I didn't even know we were capable of. The next few months were filled with small moments of progress. My mother and I didn't instantly fall into the perfect relationship. And that was okay. We learned to navigate our new dynamic, one where love was no longer defined by sacrifices or grand gestures. It was in the quiet conversations, the moments of mutual respect, and the willingness to listen without judgment. I began to trust myself more. I made choices that felt right for me, even when they went against the grain of what I thought I should be doing. I started to say no when I needed to. I stopped feeling guilty for taking time for myself, for not always being the one to fix things. I realized that I didn't have to carry the weight of the world on my shoulders. It wasn't my job to make everyone else's life perfect. It wasn't just about my mother either. I began to assess all my relationships, friendships, work connections, family ties. Where did I stand in them? Was I holding myself back in any way? Was I bending so far to meet others' expectations that I was losing touch with who I was? I spent more time in nature, taking walks in the park, sitting by the lake, finding peace in the quiet moments. I started reading books that weren't about self-improvement or productivity, but about simply existing. I felt myself becoming more grounded, more sure of my worth, not defined by my ability to please, but by my ability to simply be. The invitation came on a Friday afternoon. A familiar red envelope. My heart beat a little faster when I saw it. There was no mistaking what it was. My mother's handwriting was still elegant, curving across the front of the envelope. "Dear Alex," it began. "I would love for you to join us for a family dinner. It's not about the money. It's not about the guest list. It's simply about us being together. I hope you can make it." I didn't know how to feel. This was the same invitation I had received 100 times before, the same kind of event where the expectation of my contribution, my financial support, loomed heavy in the background. But this time, something was different. Something had shifted. The dinner wasn't about the perfect evening anymore. It wasn't about keeping up appearances or showing off. It wasn't about my mother proving something to her friends or showing them that her daughter was part of the grand picture. This time, it was about us. About family. It wasn't even about me doing anything for her. It was about her wanting to spend time with me. Simply that. I had learned that love, real love, wasn't about what I could give or how I could serve someone else's needs. It was about being seen, about being understood, and about loving without the weight of expectation. For the first time in my life, I could go to this dinner not because I had to, but because I wanted to. Because I had the space in my heart to love her back, not out of obligation, but out of choice. When I arrived at my mother's house, I wasn't sure what to expect. The last time I had come to one of these dinners, I had felt suffocated, anxious, like I was walking on eggshells. But this time was different. As I stepped inside, I noticed something immediately. The atmosphere was different. There was no tension, no sense of obligation. The guests were chatting, laughing, and the air was light. There was even music playing softly in the background. "Alex." My mother's face lit up when she saw me. She stepped forward. Not with the same formality I remembered, but with a genuine warmth that I hadn't expected. "I'm so glad you could make it. It means so much to me that you're here." I smiled, feeling something stir inside me, something that hadn't been there for a long time. I didn't feel the weight of guilt. I didn't feel the pressure to be perfect. I just felt grateful. Grateful for this moment. For the progress we had made. And for the love that was beginning to feel real again. The evening passed in a gentle blur. We ate. We talked. And I felt myself slowly letting go of all the old burdens I had carried. I wasn't the daughter who had to prove herself anymore. I wasn't the one who had to give everything to make her mother happy. I was simply myself, enjoying the evening with the people I cared about. As the night came to an end and the guests began to leave, my mother pulled me aside. She hugged me tightly. Something I hadn't expected. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything. For giving me a second chance. For being you. And for the first time in my life, I understood what it meant to be loved, not for what I could do, but for who I was." The next few months were filled with small, beautiful moments. My mother and I continued to navigate our new relationship. One based on mutual respect, understanding, and love without strings attached. We didn't have to make grand gestures to show our affection. We simply enjoyed each other's company. For me, the biggest change came in the way I saw myself. I stopped seeing my worth through the lens of my ability to meet others' needs. to sacrifice for their happiness. I realized that I was enough. Just as I was. I was no longer the daughter burdened by guilt. And I was no longer the person who felt like she had to constantly give. I was someone who had learned to love herself. And in doing so, I had finally created the space for real love that was balanced, healthy, and true. And that, I realized, was the most important thing of all.